Facing execution, Daniel's last wish was simple: to see his dog, Max, one last time. What followed was a moment that not only reunited them, but uncovered a truth buried for years. As Max's loyalty shattered a web of lies, Daniel's fight for freedom took a surprising turn. This is a story of redemption, love, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Before we move on, if you're an animal lover, tap subscribe. It's completely free, and every click inspires us to keep sharing the stories that truly touch the heart and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. The gray dawn crept over the razor wire fences of the state penitentiary, spilling pale light across the stone walls that had witnessed countless lives swallowed by silence. Inside, the air was unusually heavy, as though even the concrete sensed what the day held. Guards moved with an edge in their step, boots striking against the polished floors like drums counting down to an inevitable end. Death Row was never quiet, not truly, but that morning every whisper felt weighted, every sound echoed too loud. In cell block C, behind bars that had been his world for 7 long years, sat Daniel Harper. At 42, he bore the lines of a man who had carried regret like a chain, dragging it across every waking moment. He wasn't the same man who had first been locked inside. The sharp defiance, the fire in his eyes from years ago, had been replaced by something quieter, heavier. His hands rested loosely in his lap, wrists scarred by cuffs, yet his posture was calm, almost resigned. He knew what the day was. His last day. Executions followed a routine. The warden would ask for a final request, and most men asked for food, a call, a prayer, or a last letter. But when the warden stood before Daniel's cell and asked, Daniel's voice came out steady, almost too steady. "I want to see Max," he said. "My dog." The warden blinked, momentarily thrown off. Guards glanced at each other. A dog? Of all things, of all possible wishes on a man's final day, he wanted to see a German shepherd? The warden leaned back, lips pressed tight. "You understand," he said slowly. "This is a maximum security facility. Animals are not allowed inside. What you're asking is all I want," Daniel cut in softly. There was no fight in his tone, no anger. Just something unshakable, rooted in memory. The warden studied him. Over the years he had heard strange requests. A man wanting ice cream at sunrise, another asking for a guitar he couldn't play, one who demanded silence from every guard during his last meal. But this was different. Daniel's file was clean. No infractions, no attempts to escape. And in the personal notes, one detail had always stood out. Owned a German shepherd named Max. Dog seized at time of arrest. For Daniel, Max wasn't just a pet. He had been his shadow, his protector, his last link to a life before everything crumbled. The trial had taken his freedom. Prison had stripped him of dignity. But nothing, not the walls, not the years, had taken the memory of the dog who had loved him without question. The warden finally nodded. Under strict supervision. 10 minutes. Yard only. Word spread like fire through the prison. Some guards muttered it was reckless. Others, quieter, admitted it was the first time they had ever heard Daniel ask for anything. By mid-morning, arrangements were in motion. Daniel sat on his cot, staring at the floor, but his mind wasn't inside the cell anymore. He was back in his small house, years ago, when Max was just a clumsy pup who chewed on table legs and followed him everywhere. He could almost hear the sound of paws on hardwood, the bark that greeted him at the door, the warmth of loyalty he had taken for granted. When the hour came, Daniel was led from his cell. His hands were cuffed loosely in front of him, chains clinking with each step. The corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel carved into the end of his life. Guards flanked him, silent. The yard lay open under a sky the color of steel. A lone chair had been placed at the center. Daniel stood a few feet away, chest tight, every muscle wired with anticipation. Beyond the far gate, he heard it, the metallic screech of hinges, the faint jingle of a collar. Then he saw him. Max trotted through the gate, his black and tan coat dusted with gray now, his body carrying the stiffness of age. But his eyes, those sharp, loyal eyes, locked onto Daniel in an instant. His ears shot forward, his tail swayed once, then again, faster, until it wagged like it never had before. Daniel's breath caught. For 7 years he had carried the weight of silence, but in that single moment, his chest cracked open. He dropped to his knees, chains rattling, just as the leash was released. Max surged forward, barreling into him with a force that nearly toppled both man and dog. Whines tumbled out of the shepherd's throat, high and broken, somewhere between joy and sorrow. Daniel pressed his face into Max's fur, breathing in the scent, earth, leather, home. His arms wrapped around the animal as though holding onto the last piece of himself. The world, for a moment, disappeared. The prison walls faded. The countdown ceased. There was only the man and his dog, bound by a loyalty that years of distance hadn't cracked. But then Max stilled. His body stiffened against Daniel's chest. The wagging tail froze mid-swing. Ears angled sharply. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep inside his chest. Daniel pulled back, startled. He knew his dog's language. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't excitement. This was warning. Max's eyes weren't on Daniel anymore. They were fixed on someone across the yard. Officer Jenkins. Tall, rigid, his arms locked behind his back as he observed the scene. Max's growl deepened, teeth flashing in the pale light. Guards shifted uneasily, hands hovering near batons. "Control your dog," one muttered. But Daniel placed a calming hand on Max's back, whispering, "Easy, boy." Only it wasn't easy. Max had never growled like this without reason. Daniel's stomach twisted. He looked at Jenkins again, and in that frozen yard, with the clock ticking down on his life, a question sparked in his mind. What did his dog know that the rest of them didn't? And why, after 7 silent years, was Max growling now? The growl echoed across the yard, low and unsettling. Max's body was coiled tight, every muscle rigid with tension. Daniel, still kneeling, could feel the air between them thickening. It was as if something ancient, primal, was awake in the dog's gaze. His instincts were firing. Daniel didn't need to hear the growl to know it wasn't just a warning, it was a command. "Easy, boy," Daniel repeated, though his own voice had lost its calm. Max's growl deepened, becoming more of a rumble than a sound. The officers around the yard shifted uneasily, trying to follow protocol, but it was clear that none of them knew how to handle this situation. Jenkins stood still, facing the dog with a jaw set in a hard line, his eyes fixed on Daniel. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. But something in his stance was off, just enough for Daniel to feel it in his gut. The air felt colder, sharper. He'd known that man for years, but in that moment, something about Jenkins seemed different. There was no warmth in his gaze, only an unspoken tension. Max's eyes never left Jenkins. Daniel stood slowly, using Max's body as an anchor. He placed his hand on the dog's neck, trying to offer comfort, but he felt the tremble of unease ripple through Max's body. He wasn't just growling at a stranger, he was reacting to a presence. A presence Daniel couldn't quite place. "Max doesn't do this," Daniel muttered, his voice tight. He turned his head to Ramirez, who was standing off to the side, his arms crossed. Ramirez had always been one of the guards who treated Daniel with some respect. The older officer had never given him the look of a convict, never made him feel like he was less than a man. Ramirez's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Your dog's got a good nose," he said, looking at Max. "What's his problem with Jenkins?" Daniel's heart skipped. He didn't know. But something in his chest tightened, a knot of suspicion threading through his thoughts. "I don't know," Daniel answered softly, his voice strained. "Max doesn't growl at strangers for fun." Ramirez watched Jenkins carefully, his face unreadable. Then he said, "Funny thing, Jenkins was on duty the night you were arrested, but he never reported it." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral, but his mind was already racing. If Jenkins had been there, why hadn't he reported it? Why had he never spoken of it? That night, the night that had led to everything, to his arrest, to his conviction, was a blur of confusion. Daniel had never been given the full story. He had always wondered what had truly happened. "Are you saying Jenkins lied?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking slightly. Ramirez didn't answer, but his eyes spoke volumes. He turned his attention back to Max, who was still fixated on the officer. The growl had become more intense now, almost as if the dog could sense something Daniel couldn't. The tension in the air had reached its peak, and even the guards standing at the edges of the yard seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't just Max that was unsettled. Something in the air had changed. Jenkins finally moved. He turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps deliberate. As he moved, Max's growl followed him, relentless. The shepherd's eyes stayed locked on the officer, his body tense with restrained aggression. The moment Jenkins was out of sight, the growl stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound. It hung heavy, like an unspoken truth that no one was ready to face. The warden, who had been watching from the control tower above, called down over the loudspeaker. "What's going on down there?" His voice was sharp, clipped. Ramirez hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's nothing, sir," he said, though his eyes never left Daniel or Max, the dogs, just a little excited. The warden didn't reply immediately, but Daniel could feel the shift. The words didn't add up. This wasn't just about Max being a dog. There was something deeper, something the guards weren't willing to acknowledge. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a German shepherd, but more than that, he had been Daniel's companion for years. The bond they shared was undeniable, deep, unspoken, yet powerful. Max had always known when things were wrong. His instincts were sharper than most people's. If Max was reacting this way, it meant something wasn't right. The warden's voice crackled through the loudspeaker again, breaking the silence. "Daniel, come with me." Daniel's heart skipped. The dog was still standing close, watching him closely, as if asking for permission. As he slowly moved away from Max, he whispered, "It's okay, boy. I'll be back." Max's ears flicked, but he remained still, his eyes never leaving Daniel. The guards led Daniel toward the small interview room where he would meet the warden and the officers. His pulse quickened. He had been in these rooms before, but never under these circumstances. Never when the truth was so close to unraveling. Behind him, Max stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the door as if waiting for something, waiting for a sign. When they reached the door to the interview room, one of the officers turned to Daniel. "Wait here. The warden will be with you shortly." As Daniel stood alone in the narrow hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. Something was hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. And Max, with all his loyalty and instinct, was the one who had started it. If there was a secret buried in his past, if there was a lie that had cost him everything, he might just be standing on the edge of discovering it. But what was Jenkins hiding? And what did Max know that no one else did? The small interview room was stark, the walls painted a dull gray, and the air felt too thick, like it had been steeped in secrets for years. Daniel stood near the door, his hands still loosely shackled, his mind a blur of questions and half-formed thoughts. He had known this day would come, but he had never imagined it would start like this. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, drawing closer. Ramirez appeared first, his face unreadable. He opened the door for Daniel, giving him a slight nod. Daniel stepped inside, his heart thudding in his chest. The warden was already seated behind a metal desk, a stack of papers in front of him. His expression was stern, but there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, maybe even doubt. The door clicked shut behind Daniel, leaving them alone in the small room. "Sit down, Daniel," the warden said, his voice low. Daniel sat on the hard chair across from the warden, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling back on the man in front of him. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't understand. Why is Jenkins acting like that? And why the hell is Max growling at him?" The warden studied him for a moment, his hands folded in front of him. "We've been reviewing your case, Daniel. We've been going over the details again, and there's something that doesn't add up." Daniel's stomach clenched. He hadn't expected this sudden shift. His heart skipped in his chest, a mix of hope and fear rising inside him. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The warden paused. "Jenkins was one of the officers who responded the night you were arrested. He was the one who found you at the scene. But there's something about the report he filed that doesn't sit right." Daniel's mind raced. His arrest had been a blur. He remembered the flashing lights, the shouting, the cold handcuffs around his wrists. But Jenkins? He hadn't paid much attention to him then. What doesn't add up? Daniel asked, his voice tight. The warden leaned forward slightly. According to the report, Jenkins was the one who found the evidence that tied you to the crime. But he didn't mention that he was on duty the night of your arrest. The words hit Daniel like a slap. His eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. Jenkins had been there? Why hadn't he said anything? What was he hiding? The report says Jenkins was just passing by, but there's no record of his involvement in the arrest. The warden's voice was even, but there was an edge to it now. It's almost as if he wanted to keep his presence out of the official record. Ramirez, who had been standing in the corner, stepped forward. We've also spoken to a witness, Daniel. Someone who saw Jenkins leave your house that night before the police arrived. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the crack in the case, the thing he had been waiting for. But it was hard to believe, hard to accept that something was finally breaking through the walls of his conviction. Why would Jenkins leave before the police arrived? Daniel asked, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and anger. What the hell is he hiding? Ramirez exchanged a glance with the warden before answering. We don't know yet, but we're going to find out. The room fell silent as Daniel processed the new information. His mind was reeling, struggling to make sense of it all. He had spent 7 years in this place, 7 years carrying the weight of a crime he hadn't committed, and now it seemed like the truth was finally starting to surface. But why now? Why after all these years? The warden's voice broke the silence. We've reopened the investigation. Jenkins's actions are under review, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. But we need to know, what did Max sense today? Daniel looked up, surprised by the question. Max? I don't know. He's always been protective of me. He doesn't trust people easily. But with Jenkins, it was different. The warden nodded. Max is a smart dog. A loyal one. It's not common for a dog to react like that unless there's something to react to. Ramirez spoke next, his voice low. Max has a nose for things, Daniel. He's been with you through everything. If he's sensing something off with Jenkins, it's because there's something there. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces began to fall into place. Max had always been there for him. He had never failed to protect him, never failed to sense danger, even when Daniel couldn't. And today, in that yard, Max had sensed something in Jenkins, something that no one else had noticed. Do you think Jenkins is involved in the crime? Daniel asked, his voice tight with the weight of the question. The warden's eyes flickered, but he didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. We're going to find out. The investigation is just beginning. But if Jenkins is involved in this, it changes everything. Daniel's mind was spinning, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. He had always known there was something wrong with his conviction, something off about the entire trial. But he had never imagined it could go this deep. Jenkins had been involved in his arrest, and now it seemed like the man was hiding something that could set Daniel free. Max, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. Max knew all along. The warden's eyes softened, but he said nothing. The room was silent for a long moment, each person lost in their own thoughts. Finally, the warden stood, breaking the silence. We'll continue to investigate. But for now, you're free to go back to your cell. Daniel stood, his mind still racing with the enormity of what had just been revealed. As he walked to the door, Ramirez's voice stopped him. We'll get the truth, Daniel, Ramirez said, his tone steady. And when we do, Jenkins will answer for what he did. Daniel nodded, but inside, a part of him was still waiting, still wondering what would happen next. He had been given a second chance, a crack in the door to the truth. And he wasn't going to let it close without pushing for what he deserved. As the door clicked shut behind him, Daniel felt a surge of hope. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The walls of the prison felt closer than ever as Daniel walked back to his cell. The usual rhythm of footsteps, clanging gates, and murmured conversations seemed distant now, drowned out by the pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, there was a crack in the darkness, a sliver of light that beckoned him towards something he couldn't quite define but knew was coming. His mind raced. Jenkins had been there that night. He had been at the scene, but no one had ever mentioned it. The idea that someone, especially someone in a position of authority, could manipulate the truth so completely was a bitter pill to swallow. But it wasn't just about Jenkins anymore. It was about the system that had failed him, about the chain of lies that had led him here to this final day. Max, the dog. His dog. Max had always known, always been there in ways no human ever could. The way he had reacted in the yard, the growl that had stopped Daniel's heart, wasn't just the instinct of a dog. It was a warning, a signal that the person who had once stood by his side was hiding something. As he reached his cell, the sound of the heavy door sliding open seemed louder than it had in years. The guards led him inside. The usual routine resumed, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. When the door shut behind him, he sat on his cot, his mind still spinning. The officers had made it clear that the investigation was ongoing, that Jenkins would be questioned, but Daniel knew how slow things moved inside these walls. The system wasn't quick to reveal its flaws. The wheels of justice turned with the weight of 1,000 years of bureaucracy. But the truth was out there now, somewhere. And it wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about the people who had turned their backs on him. Daniel closed his eyes and leaned back against the cold wall. He remembered the early days of his arrest, the trial, the way his life had unraveled in an instant. The world had looked at him and seen only guilt. They had seen a man who had lost his way. But they hadn't seen the truth, the way Max had stood by him, the way they had fought through the darkest moments together. Max had always been the constant. He had never judged. He had never walked away. In the yard, when he had looked into Max's eyes, he had seen the same loyalty, the same love. The bond between them was undeniable. It was raw, unspoken, yet deeper than anything Daniel had experienced with another person. Max had never turned away, even when the world had. He stood up, pacing the small cell, his mind still racing. The truth was coming, piece by piece. Jenkins had lied. He had been involved in something much darker than anyone could have imagined. And now, Daniel had the chance to expose it. But there was still a part of him that was scared. Fear wasn't something he had allowed himself to feel for a long time. Not since the day he had stepped into this place. But now, as the walls seemed to close in around him, he couldn't help but wonder, what if the truth wasn't enough? What if everything he had fought for, his life, his freedom, was just another lie wrapped in a different form? The knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. One of the guards stood there, his expression unreadable. "Warden wants to see you." Daniel's heart skipped. This was it. The investigation was moving forward. There was no turning back now. He followed the guard down the long hallway, the familiar sounds of the prison ringing in his ears. The air felt different now, charged with the possibility of change. It wasn't just the weight of the prison that pressed down on him. It was the weight of everything that had been hidden. And now, it was coming to light. The warden's office was as cold and sterile as ever. The man sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he looked over a stack of papers. Daniel could see the tension in his face, the subtle shift in his posture. There was something important happening here, something that had the potential to change everything. "Sit down, Daniel," the warden said, his voice tight. Daniel obeyed, sitting across from him, his hands resting on his knees. His mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We've made progress," the warden said after a long moment. "The investigation into Jenkins is moving quickly. We've found new evidence, fingerprints, witness statements, that confirm his involvement." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The pieces were falling into place faster than he had expected. "We're also reopening the case," the warden continued. "This isn't just about Jenkins anymore. It's about the entire investigation. There's a lot that doesn't add up, Daniel. And we're going to find out what happened." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The crack in the wall, the light breaking through. But even now, a small part of him couldn't quite believe it. He had been here before, hoping for a way out, only to have it slip through his fingers. But Max had never given up on him. And now, Daniel wasn't going to give up either. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want the truth." The warden's eyes softened. "We'll get you the truth, Daniel. And when we do, you'll be free." The words hung in the air like a promise. As Daniel stood up to leave, his mind was already racing ahead. He could see it now, the end of this chapter, the beginning of something new. Max would be waiting for him. His loyal companion, his dog, the one who had never judged him, never given up on him. And when Daniel walked out of this prison, it would be with the truth in his hands and his dog by his side. The days after the warden's visit felt like a blur of activity, a whirlwind of interviews, statements, and legal proceedings. The walls of the prison, once so familiar, began to feel like they were shrinking around Daniel, not with the weight of his own confinement, but with the weight of something much bigger, a chance at redemption that was finally within reach. Jenkins was no longer a shadow, he was a target. The investigation had snowballed faster than anyone had anticipated, new witnesses coming forward, new pieces of evidence linking him to the crime Daniel had been convicted of. The fingerprints on the evidence didn't belong to Daniel. They belonged to Jenkins, the man who had planted false evidence, the man who had lied to cover his tracks. It was happening. It was really happening. Daniel sat in the small interview room again, the familiar coldness of the metal chair beneath him reminding him of the long, silent years he had spent in this place. But now, there was a hum of electricity in the air, a sense that the world outside was finally catching up to the truth. The door opened, and the warden stepped inside, his face tight, but relieved. "Daniel," the warden said, "you're not going to believe this, but the case is officially reopened. Jenkins has been arrested." Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. It was a moment he had been waiting for, a moment that had felt impossible just days ago. But here it was, right in front of him. They've charged him with obstruction of justice, perjury, and, in light of the new evidence, the murder he framed you for. The warden paused, watching Daniel closely. "It's over, Daniel. The charges against you are being dropped." Daniel sat there, his mind racing. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was real, it felt surreal. He had spent so long in this place, so long fighting for something he couldn't even fully explain: freedom, redemption, justice. And now, it was finally coming true. But even as the weight of the news sank in, there was a small voice in the back of his mind, a voice that was still hesitant. What did this really mean? How could the world, so quick to judge him, suddenly shift so drastically? Was this enough to undo the years of pain, the years of feeling invisible, worthless? I don't know what to say," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The warden's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. You've been through enough. The truth is out now, and that's all that matters." Daniel nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about Max, the dog, his loyal companion, the one who had never given up on him. Max had always been there, even when the world had written Daniel off. He had been the one constant in his life, the one living thing that had always looked at him with eyes full of trust, eyes that never saw the man in the prison jumpsuit, never saw the convict. Max had seen the man inside, broken, lost, but still fighting. And now, Daniel was fighting for something else, a life outside these walls, a life that would finally feel like his own again. "Where's Max?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. The warden smiled faintly. "He's waiting for you. He's been at the shelter the whole time, waiting for the day you would walk out of here. We're bringing him to you now." Daniel stood, his legs weak beneath him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something else, a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about the end of his sentence. It was about the beginning of something new. The beginning of a life he had thought was lost. As he walked out of the interview room, the sound of his footsteps was different. It wasn't the familiar clink of chains, the dragging of a man locked away in a cage. It was the sound of a man stepping into freedom. The hallway felt endless, but in a way, that didn't matter anymore. The weight of the prison had already started to lift. The doors, the bars, the walls, they were all just memories now, fading as fast as his past. When Daniel reached the yard, the air felt different. Brighter, cleaner. And then he saw him. Max, the German shepherd, trotted toward him, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his tail wagging so fast that it almost looked like a blur. Daniel's heart slammed in his chest. Max's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time in 7 years, they were both free. Max ran, closing the distance between them in seconds, and as soon as he reached Daniel, he jumped up, his paws landing on Daniel's chest. Daniel caught him instinctively, dropping to his knees as Max's face nuzzled into his neck, his whole body shaking with excitement. "Hey, boy," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it. We made it, Max." Max licked his face, barking happily, his whole body vibrating with joy. It was the kind of joy only a dog could understand, the kind of joy that didn't care about the past, about the mistakes, about the years lost. Daniel wrapped his arms around Max, pulling him close, breathing in the familiar scent of earth, leather, and home. He didn't care that there were still questions to be answered, that Jenkins's lies hadn't all been exposed yet. None of that mattered in this moment. He was free. They were free. The warden stood a few feet away, watching them. "I'll leave you two alone," he said softly. "Take all the time you need." As he turned to walk away, Daniel stood, lifting Max in his arms. There was a whole world waiting for them now. A world where they could walk together without chains, without walls. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. The sky was wide and open, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past slipping away. The future was waiting. And whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. Max would be by his side. Always. The world outside the prison gates was different. Daniel had imagined what freedom would feel like, but nothing could have prepared him for the rush of air, the wide open space, the sheer weightlessness of it all. The moment he stepped into the sunlight, the weight of 7 years of confinement seemed to melt away. But as he looked down at Max, who was still wagging his tail, jumping around in excitement, it was clear that this wasn't just his victory. This was their victory. Max's eyes sparkled with the same joy Daniel was feeling. He had been the one constant in Daniel's life, the one who had never wavered, never judged. And now, they were both free. The sound of passing cars, the murmur of voices, the rustling of leaves in the wind, it all felt so new, so raw. After years of silence, of nothing but the clink of chains and the sterile, unforgiving walls of the prison, Daniel could hardly believe it. He had lived through the darkest days of his life here, and now, the world was open again. But even with all this newfound freedom, a part of him couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The years that had been taken from him couldn't be undone. The months spent in a cell, in fear, in isolation, still lingered like an invisible weight. Max nudged his hand with his nose, pulling him from his thoughts. Daniel smiled, ruffling the dog's fur. "I know, buddy," he said softly. "We've got a lot of catching up to do." As they walked down the street, the familiar sights of the world outside felt strange. People moved past them, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. It was jarring, this dissonance between his own reality and the world that had moved on without him. But Max was there, at his side, a reminder that not everything had changed. The first few days were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and a sense of uncertainty that Daniel couldn't shake. Even though he was free, the world was still a maze he had to navigate. He was a man without a past, without a future. The years in prison had stolen both, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dog that never stopped believing in him. He found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, away from the chaos of the downtown streets. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what Daniel needed. The apartment was modest, just enough room for him and Max. There was a small kitchen, a couch, and a bed where they could both rest. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he could breathe. Max seemed to settle in quickly. He'd curl up at the foot of Daniel's bed at night, always within arm's reach. During the day, they would take long walks through the park, just the two of them, no one else in sight. There were no guards, no metal bars, no shackles. Just open space and the freedom to walk at their own pace. Daniel didn't have a plan, didn't know what the future would hold. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the past define him. The life he had before the prison, the life he had lost, wasn't going to be his future. He started volunteering at an animal shelter, the same shelter where Max had waited for him. There was something cathartic about working with animals, about caring for creatures who had no judgment, no past to hold against them. Daniel connected with the dogs in a way he hadn't expected. He saw a little bit of himself in each of them, lost, afraid, waiting for someone to believe in them. And when a dog found its forever home, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, knowing that he had been part of their journey. One afternoon, as he was walking Max through the park, Daniel heard the sound of a voice calling his name. It was familiar, but distant, like a memory he hadn't fully remembered. He turned to see a man walking toward him, a hesitant smile on his face. "Daniel?" the man asked, his voice uncertain. Daniel's heart skipped. "Yeah." The man stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "I'm Detective Samuels. I was part of the team investigating your case. I wanted to apologize." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Apologize?" Samuels nodded, his eyes full of regret. "I didn't believe you. Not at first. I thought you were guilty. But when the new evidence came to light, I couldn't ignore it. I had to come and say, I'm sorry for what I did. For what I didn't do." Daniel stood there, shocked, his mind struggling to process the words. Apologize? He had spent so long fighting for the truth, and now this man, a part of the system that had failed him, was standing before him, offering an apology. "I didn't want to believe you were innocent," Samuels continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I was wrong. I just wanted you to know that." For a long moment, Daniel didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never expected an apology, never expected anyone to admit the mistakes that had led to his conviction. But as he looked at the man in front of him, he felt something shift inside. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was something he had to learn to do. "I appreciate that," Daniel said finally, his voice steady. "But you don't need to apologize. I'm free now. That's all that matters." The detective nodded, his eyes sincere. "Take care of yourself, Daniel. Take care of Max." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the park with Max by his side. As they continued their walk, Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. The past would always be there, a part of him that couldn't be erased. But the future, his future, was still ahead of him, and he had the chance to shape it however he wanted. He wasn't defined by his past. He was defined by his choices. And with Max by his side, Daniel knew there was nothing he couldn't face.